Welcome to For Better or For Court, Family Law in New Jersey.
Welcome back to For Better or For Court, Family Law in New Jersey with Alix Claps. Alix is a partner at Heyman and Fletcher and a certified matrimonial law attorney who helps New Jersey families handle divorce, custody, and complex family matters with clarity and care. I'm Lisa Mosbey, and today we're talking about grandparents' rights and when New Jersey courts may grant visitation to a grandparent. Welcome, Alix. I am super excited for this conversation because grandparents should get to see their grandchildren.
Good morning, Lisa. And, like with everything else, it's sometimes yes and sometimes no for grandparents.
Yeah, and it's hard because there's this unique connection, this bond that happens with grandparents and their grandchildren. It's just amazing to me that anyone would want to block that, but we understand it happens. Do grandparents actually have legal rights to visitation in New Jersey?
In some contexts, yes, there is a grandparents visitation statute, and most people think of it in terms of a post-divorce family where one parent's blocking the grandparents of the other spouse from seeing the kids, something like that. But you will find cases where intact mom and dad don't want the grandparents, for some reason or other, to be involved with the grandchildren. And the grandparents feel that they have the right to sue or intervene to get access to their grandkids. Those cases do not usually go well because if mom and dad are making this choice, there's usually a reason for that.
So when can a grandparent ask a court for visitation in New Jersey?
So the burden on a grandparent when filing for visitation is to demonstrate to the court that the child would miss something more than the ordinary grandparent-grandchild relationship. So this isn't just a grandparent who had been in the kid's life on holidays or for special events. This is now has become a case where grandparents usually have to demonstrate that they were involved in the child's development, that they were involved with the child's day-to-day, that they lived with the child for a time. There's an 8-part test, but ultimately it's extremely fact-specific.
What does a grandparent need to show to get court-ordered visitation?
As with most cases, the more actual documentation you can show about what did you do with the child? How long have you been involved in the child's life? Were you the one picking the child up from school? Were you an authorized pickup on a day-to-day basis? Show me the pictures of you with the kid at the zoo and you with the kid at the beach and you teaching the kid how to write, you reading to the child. Show me you putting the child to bed. Show me those documents. Show me a calendar. How often was the child staying with you or were you staying with the child? This is so much more about the actual facts than any legal analysis that a court's going to come across. So, calendars, photos, documentation, witnesses are good too, but the more unassailable documentation you have, the more you can demonstrate that I was more than just this grandparent that saw the kid on Christmas. I was there. I was part of this child's development. Part of that too depends on how old is this child. It's really hard for a grandparent to demonstrate, hey, there's this 3-month-old that I wanted to file a lawsuit and have visitation rights to, because you haven't had the time to develop that. But you've got an 8-year-old who sees this grandma and grandpa as another set of parents. They're going to be harmed if the grandparents aren't able to see them anymore.
Yeah, there's oftentimes such an influence. They've been their babysitters. They've been a point of contact for that child more than mom and dad sometimes when they're working full time. And then just to rip them away from, I can imagine the emotional distress that some children go through. But how does the court balance a parent's right to make decisions for their child against the grandparent's request for a visitation?
I'll say that most of the time when I see a successful grandparent's application, it's not the parent who is biologically related to those grandparents who is creating the distance. It is almost always the result of, unfortunately, the death of one of the parents, incarceration, substance abuse, something where that parent is more or less removed from the equation, and it's the other parent fighting with parent A's parents about what involvement, because now maybe you've got 2 sets of people who think they're acting in this child's best interest, but neither of them has been the primary residence. None of them have been as involved as they maybe should have been from the beginning. So then the court's really got to sift through. And again, the analysis is always going to focus on what is in the best interest of this child. So sometimes that might be the biological parent, and maybe the grandparents have the right to visitation, and maybe they don't. And sometimes the grandparents can establish that they are in fact the de facto parent, or what New Jersey calls the psychological parent. And then we're looking at more of an even footing in a custody dispute rather than a visitation dispute.
And you mentioned their involvement. It's predominantly how involved that grandparent or those grandparents were. But how difficult is it for grandparents to win a visitation case? Is this a long drawn out process? Is it a couple of hours in court? What's the difficulty level here?
It depends.
Course.
Sometimes, some of the most successful ones I've seen are where the grandparents take action quickly, because one of the factors is how long has it been since your involvement with the child has been what it was while the family was intact. So if you've been the caregiver and parent B is suddenly saying, hey, parent A's parents, I don't want you involved anymore, the faster you can get to court, the more likely you are to be successful, because you are there for the continuity of this child's relationship with you. So that's important. If you wait too long, if circumstances change, then it can be problematic. I've also seen cases where by jumping in and filing and showing, here's what I'm going to here's the argument I'm going to make to the court, we're able to reach an agreement instead of having a court make the decision, which ultimately usually works out best for the child.
And you did mention some of the evidence, like calendars, appointments scheduled. A lot of times grandparents don't have that. I know my folks, they really didn't have calendars. It's like they were just always there. So I think evidence would be difficult. Is social media evidence in these cases? Seeing pictures with the grandparents, if things get posted about their activities, would that count? Or are there other kinds of evidence that would contribute to a successful case?
Social media is great evidence, especially, often there's a photo involved, and you can hear comments from friends in real time about, how much fun they had running into the grandparents and the grandchild at the zoo or whatever. Sometimes you have, a timeline of documentation that way. Or, if the grandparents were at the birthday party and there's photos of the birthday party posted by other people who were there that show the interaction of the grandparent and the grandchild, that can be very helpful because that's more objective than, something that the grandparents might put together. I also think, if the grandparents are the one taking the kid to the pediatrician, there's always going to be a record of who took the child to the doctor. Sometimes if you get a preschool login or log out, you've got a signature page of who was there. So think about the many ways in which we are inadvertently tracked throughout our lives can be useful in a context where you're trying to demonstrate to the court, hey, I was there. I was the one who was there.
Yeah, I forgot about those. The kids are being checked in and checked out all the time. Yeah. More places than I realize. Do you have a story to share, like a situation or case where a grandparent visitation dispute was more complex than it initially appeared, and what ultimately resolved it?
One of my very first trials when I became a family law attorney was a grandparent situation. And it's one of the more, one of those tragic situations where granddaughter, mom had lived with grandma and grandpa. Dad was absent. Dad was not a part of this child's life. And the child was, I think, 6 or 7, and mom passed away just from an underlying heart condition. So dad suddenly comes back into the picture, and there's this child who's been living with grandma and grandpa for 6, 7 years, hasn't seen dad in a long time. And dad says, well, Dad, I want to move this child to where I live, which is the next state over. It would happen to be, 3 or 4 hours away, not across the country, but far enough to be a significant consideration. And we had to go to trial on it. And in that case, it was a multi-stage process, because first the court has to consider, well, is this a grandparent application or is this a psychological parent application? And then you have the relocation aspect. And we ended up going all the way through a trial. The court rendered a decision. Other things happened after that sort of settled it more specifically in favor of the grandparents, but the granddaughter lives with the grandparents. She's probably in high school by now. She might even have graduated high school by now. It's been a long time, but we resolved it. And, we wanted to always promote, I represented the grandparents in this situation. We wanted to promote the positive development of the relationship with dad and with dad's other child. There was a half sibling involved too, but we did not believe, and ultimately the court, I think, also did not believe that moving this child to an entirely new environment was in this child's best interest.
What are some common misunderstandings grandparents have about their rights when they first meet with an attorney?
If all they have done is read the statute, they might come in and think they've got a slam dunk just by virtue of being grandparents. And that's not the case. I'll say there has been sort of a wild swing in New Jersey law. There was a time where grandparents had no rights. And then this statute went into effect and it was a little too far, a little overcorrected. And so there was a time when just by virtue of being grandma or grandpa, you could come in and get a court order to have visitation rights. Now, there's the body of case law that sort of demonstrates here's what you actually need. So if grandparents come in, I'm going to say, before the divorce, what was your relationship with the grandchildren? What is it now? Where are we in the timeline? I'm going to try and gather all of the facts that I know a court's going to look for so we can look at whether these grandparents have a good case to take to court or whether we should try very hard to focus on mediating something or trying to reach an agreement outside because maybe a judge isn't going to find in your favor.
And can these disputes sometimes resolve through mediation or family agreements without a judge making the decision?
Absolutely. Sometimes filing the application is what prompts the meaningful mediation discussions, whether it involves an actual mediator or just negotiation between the parties or with the aid of an attorney. A lot of times just demonstrating that you're serious by filing the application with the court gets everybody to the table. Sometimes it makes it worse, but a lot of times it does, in fact, just get everybody to the table to discuss, hey, you know what? We got off the rails at some point, but here's what's in the best interest of this child. And we all agree that we're acting in this child's best interest. So here's what we want to do.
So, Alix, for grandparents who have recently lost contact with a grandchild, what should they know before deciding whether to pursue legal action?
I think talking to an attorney is always your best first step. That doesn't mean you have to run to the courthouse to file something, but an attorney, a trained family law attorney is going to know the questions to ask. So you could help figure out what your circumstances are, how your circumstances relate to the law in place in New Jersey, and what the best approach for your case is going to be.
And I think we'll leave it there for today. This has been valuable information. Thank you so much for sharing your insights.
Thank you, Lisa.
That's it for today's episode of For Better or For Court. If you have questions about grandparents' rights or visitation issues in New Jersey, please visit heymanfletcherlaw.com to connect with Alix Claps and learn more about your options. Thank you for listening. Be sure to like, leave a review. Go ahead and subscribe if you want to join us next time. We'll see you there.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to hit that like and subscribe button and leave us a review in the comments.